Now bind is quite a bit different from call and apply, but it still allows us to establish the object referenced by the keyword this. As call and apply would invoke the function immediately, bind actually returns a function, and then we have to invoke that function in a separate statement. Let's look at a simple example, and then we will look at how it can bind an object to the keyword this. So I'm going to set up our simple function again, test. Just logging to the console, the word test, that's all we're doing. Go ahead and put the semicolons in. Now, if we wanted to do this with bind, if we wanted to invoke this function with bind, we actually need to store the results of bind in a variable. Because remember, I said bind returns a function. So if we set up const new fun like this, and we set that equal to test.bind, now if we go ahead and save that, and I'm going to jump back to the console really quick and take a look at the variable new fun. We can see that contains a function. That's exactly what is returned from bind to that variable. So now, if we want to invoke that function, we use the variable and invoke it like this. And now we can see that that returns test. So that is how we use bind. We need to remember that it returns a function. Now let me go ahead and comment out this right here, and we're going to copy in the two objects we were using in the previous topic. We're using for call and apply. Let me just copy and paste those in so you don't watch me create them again. So here are two objects, and if we want to use bind to borrow this function for obj2 like we did with call and apply, remember bind's going to return a new function, so we need a place to put that. So I'm going to set up a variable here. Let's make that a const. Call it display, and we'll set that equal to obj.displayname dot bind, whoops, and then we pass in the object we want to have the keyword this reference, so obj2. So now that's going to set up, pass in a function to display. But the difference now is that function will have obj2 bound to the keyword this. So whenever we invoke it, it will run as if the keyword this points to obj2. So let's go ahead and run that like this, and we'll save that, and as you can see, we get Lynette now. Now with call and apply, we looked at using parameters. So what do we do about parameters here? Well, let's go ahead and do the same thing. Oh, let me put the parameters up here first. Let's go ahead and do that exact same thing that we did with call and apply. Whoops, greet. And we want to concatenate that to name, and then concatenate that to punct, like that. Now, the interesting thing about bind is, since it's returning a function, we can go ahead and pass in those parameters now with this new function. So I could simply do this type of thing. And if we go ahead and save that, we see we get hi Lynette out. So the parameters don't have to be a part of bind. We can use bind just to establish that keyword this reference, and then the function that is returned, we can then pass parameters in that way. However, we could also bind the parameters to this function. And what does that mean? Well, that means that if we pass the parameters in, that function is already going to work whenever we invoke it as if it's passing these parameters. So let's go ahead and look at that. So if I put a comma here and do a hi, and then we'll do another one with an exclamation point, and now I'm going to remove it down here like this. And if we go ahead and save that, we can see we still get the same results. So this function now has an object bound to the keyword this, and it has parameters bound to it. That's what we have with this function that's now returned. So really, when you get down to it, bind has two different functions. We can bind an object to the keyword this for a particular function that's returned, and we can bind parameters for a particular function. We can do both together, as we saw here in this example, but we don't have to. For example, bind is used frequently to bind parameters to a function and doesn't do anything with the keyword this. So in place of this parameter here, a null is passed in, and therefore the keyword this gets set to null, which in this case it would cause a problem because we're invoking a method that uses the keyword this. But in a function that doesn't use the keyword this at all, we don't really need to bind anything to that keyword. And so we could pass in null and just pass in the parameters. Now, this technique of using bind in this way to bind parameters to a new function is called currying or partial application. And this is a topic we'll cover later. But I wanted to mention to you that bind really has those two functions. I think it would have been better if these two functions of bind would have been separated into two different commands, but they weren't. So when you're looking at JavaScript code, or when you're using JavaScript code, you end up seeing bind used in a couple of different ways. All right, now let's move on to some topics where we're going to use call, apply, and bind to solve some of the problems we identified when we lose the object bound to the keyword this.